Hi, everyone, and welcome to our workshop today on career planning for scientists. As means of an introduction, first and foremost, my name is Amanda Dumschlanger, and I am a career counselor in the Office of Intramural Training and Education. And I have worked at the NIH for almost 6 years now. And so I've been able to work with a lot of scientists at different stages in their career, all the way from postbacks to staff scientists. So I'm hoping that today's workshop will help give you some tips and guidance when you're thinking about career planning and a framework that you can use for career decision making going forward. First and foremost, a few sort of housekeeping items. Everybody is muted. So if you have questions, please feel free to send them in the question box. And I'm going to maybe check if I have time throughout the presentation just to see what questions are coming in. But I'm definitely going to allow for time at the end of my presentation to try and go through as many questions as I can. Given that we only have an hour together today, I'm likely not going to be able to answer all of the questions, but I will do my very best. And if there are questions, I will try to follow up with you personally, depending on the questions that are asked. So as another disclaimer before we begin, I've done my best to try and share resources in today's presentation that are available to everyone. I recognize that a lot of people are signing in who maybe aren't affiliated with NIH. So some of the resources, especially if I ever mention sort of a one-on-one appointment with a career counselor, those are only available for current trainees at the NIH. But for the most part, throughout the presentation, I'm going to be giving you some resources that are publicly accessible to all. Okay, great. Now that I've gone through sort of a few of those housekeeping items, let's go ahead and get started with the presentation. Okay, so at the core of career planning and decision making, it really involves a lot of introspection. This is a really highly personal process, and there are no right or wrong answers. And so really my aim for today's workshop is to simply give you a framework and some guidance to kind of keep in the back of your mind as you enter this lifelong process. And career planning and decision making can sometimes feel like it's something that you only do once in your life, but the truth of the matter is it's something that you're going to need to continue to do throughout your career and throughout your life. So if we had sort of the time and the space today, if I were to ask everybody who's in attendance to share with me how you personally define career satisfaction and success, I know we would get a wide variety of different answers. So really, I want you to kind of think about what that means for you, particularly in terms of what's going to give you meaning, not only within your career, but also within your life overall, because your job and your career path should ideally sort of fit into what you see as a bigger picture for your life. So that's one of the first sort of defining questions that's really going to be at the heart of today's presentation. Most career counselors and anybody who works in the career development world really feel that an ideal career is something that is at the intersection and helps encompass your skills, your values, and your interests. And we in the career development world talk about skills, values, and interests so much and so often that we actually often refer to it as SVI, sort of the SVI trifecta. And this is really the framework and the main way that we sort of think about career decision making. And anytime somebody comes in to meet with me, a lot of my questioning about their motivation going forward often centers around these different areas: your skills, your values, and your interests. So before we move forward and continue talking about sort of the professional development plan, I want to take a moment just to kind of recognize that this is really hard. And I commend you all for signing in and attending this workshop, because taking the step to think about your career planning is not always easy. Career planning and job searches in general are about transitions, and transitions are often difficult for people because you often have to deal with a lot of uncertainty. The future is pretty ambiguous for most of us. You have to deal with discomfort of deeply examining yourself and identifying sort of what your interests are, what your skills are, what your values are. And then just by virtue of applying for different positions, you're putting yourself in a position to be examined by others. And within that, you may face rejection and then need to sort of develop resilience during this process. So there are a lot of different and things that you have to manage when you're talking about career planning and job search. So not only are you sort of managing the logistics of it, but you're also often dealing with sort of the emotions that come up for people as they're thinking about planning for their futures. And then the last point, and this is something that I see a lot with the trainees that I work with, a lot of times people have to sort of let go of maybe prior plans or ideas that they had for themselves. Sometimes I will meet with postdocs who, went to graduate school, did a postdoc, a really rigorous postdoc, and anticipated that they were going to be going on an academic job search. And then for whatever reason, their projects or the job market didn't allow that to happen. And so they're having to reassess and think about what they want to do sort of in a non-academic sphere. Similarly, if you are coming from a family or a culture that has very specific ideas about what they want you to do, sometimes it's hard to kind of pull yourself out of that sphere and to think about what it actually is for you that you're most interested in doing. So thinking about that last point, and some of the messages that you are hearing all the time, really, about careers and career options, I want you to reflect on what are some of the messages that you have heard about careers and your options. I think people are hearing messages constantly. Some of them are kind of offhanded remarks or comments, or maybe it's something that, depending on your family or culture, have been ingrained in you from a young age. I have a really close friend who her mother often told her to choose a career that would be conducive to having a family, not considering that this person didn't want to have children at all in their life. And so I think a lot of the sort of advice that you might hear from others, even others of older generations, are often well intended, but they might not be the right message for you at this time in your life. Some of the messages that we often hear people remark on surrounding careers are listed here. So I'm going to go through them, and maybe some of them will resonate with you. Maybe there are others that you feel like you're hearing a lot. But we often hear people say, just do what makes you happy. Follow what you're passionate about. Or money doesn't bring happiness. Or conversely, some people will say, money is really important in a career. You should really be focusing on that. All the money is in STEM careers. You should go into STEM. People might say, you're too smart to be a blank, fill it in with whatever. Or you're not smart enough or hard enough worker or whatever it might be in order to succeed in this role. This often is the case for people applying to medical school or graduate school. This is going to take too much time and it's going to cost way too much money. Are you sure you really want to do this? People often hear, you're so good at blank, you should be a blank. How will you support a family one day? That sort of harkens back to what my friend was hearing from her mother. Or if you become A, you'll never see your family. You're never going to have a good work-life balance if you go into that career. And then lastly, we expect you to be a blank so you can make money and take care of us. So I want you to spend some time kind of reflecting on what the messages are that you're hearing, particularly about careers, and how that has impacted your decision making so far, and also to just be cognizant of how that's going to impact your decision making going forward. So how do people make career decisions? Usually the career decision process is, as this slide shows, a pyramid where in an ideal world, you're first and foremost doing some self-assessment, thinking about your skills, your values, your interests. Then you're going into exploration. What, who, where, how. The self-assessment is really sort of doing the internal research and thinking about what's going to be important for you. The exploration is often focusing on the external research that you're doing about career options. And then most of the time it happens where people are focusing and trying to find skills, certifications, and qualifications in order to be competitive for those sought out positions. And then going forward and doing either a job search or a grad school search or a med school search, whatever it might be, in order to kind of take that action step. So in an ideal world, people will focus sort of on the bottom and move up through this process. But more often than not, what I see people do is they plunge right into the top, and they often go right into the job search, focusing on their resumes, the interviews, the networking piece of it. And many times I'll have people come into my office and ask me to review a resume or a CV for a program that they're applying to. And when I ask a few more questions about sort of their motivation and how they see this fitting into their long-term career plans, they really don't know why this is what they're wanting to do. And they have clearly not done sort of the baseline legwork of that self-assessment and that exploration in order to feel really confident and be really clear and focused about the direction and the trajectory that you're going. So as you're thinking about this, the career decision process can often be broken down and put in another way in kind of 4 steps. And there are lots of different online tools, a lot of different free versions that you can find, and maybe even your university or specific institute has a professional development plan that they can help walk you through. A lot of times this is called either a professional development plan or an individual development plan. But even if there's not necessarily a form that you're using to fill out, you can think about it in sort of these 4 steps. So step 1 is self-analysis, and within that falls the skills, values, and interests. Step number 2 is the research and career exploration. Step number 3 is goal setting. And step number 4 would be any action items. So the job search, the school applications. For the purposes of today's workshop and presentation, I'm really going to focus on step number 1 and the self-analysis, and really break it down into different things that you can do in order to help identify what your skills, values, and interests are. I'm going to touch on the other steps as well, but I'm just not going to spend as much time going into specific detail about it. Okay, so self-analysis, thinking about your skills. And so maybe at this point in your career and your life, you kind of already have, hopefully, an idea of where your natural talents and your skills lie. Skills are often one of those things that really can be learned and enhanced, but it is best to sort of identify and exploit your natural talents. When you're going forward, it is important to think about defining these skills as specifically as possible. So for career exploration, and especially for sort of that step number 4, those action items, whether you're doing a job search or a grad med school search, thinking about how you can market yourself appropriately for different opportunities and be as specific as possible and giving examples and anecdotes of times that you've highlighted these skills throughout your past experiences. That's going to be really key because a big part of step number 4 eventually is really marketing yourself for the opportunity at hand. So a quick note though, being good at something does not always mean that you actually like it or that it's something you want to do all of the time. So it kind of goes back to the messages around careers that I mentioned. And you might have, a very strong talent in math or engineering, or you might be really good with your hands, but that's not something that you necessarily want to do in a vocation. And so making sure that you sort of identify where those natural talents are, but actually what you would want to use in a career. And then thinking about identifying your transferable skills. If you're not familiar with this phrase, transferable skills are skills that you gain in one experience, but that it can be applied to a different experience. And in my time as a career counselor at the NIH, I often have found that a lot of junior scientists have a difficult time identifying their transferable skills. So many times people will, when they're applying for maybe non-academic or non-bench jobs, will come in and say, I only know how to pipette. I really only think of myself as hands at a bench. I don't have any administrative skills. I don't have any writing skills. And that leads to often a larger discussion about what somebody did within their role and within their experience. I think a lot of times people sell themselves a little too short and aren't thinking fully about all of the things that often go within lab work in particular. So often it is a person thinking about and brainstorming and kind of researching and doing literature reviews about ideas that they want to explore, drafting sort of an initial proposal, presenting that proposal to your PI, presenting your results and findings at lab meetings. So there are often a lot of sort of verbal and communication skills that come into working at a bench or working in the lab. So it's a matter of just identifying what those are in order to market yourself for positions going forward. Some general categories of skills to think about are here. This is definitely not an exhaustive list by any means, but as you're thinking about skills, verbal, written, analytical, problem solving, leadership, teamwork, those are often really key skills. And I actually bolded them because without fail, when I'm talking to recruiters or even when I'm talking to search committees, these skills are often sort of the most highly valued. So thinking about those skills in particular and examples that you could provide to show that you have done those skills and that you have done them well. Some other skills to think about would be math, financial, physical, hands-on, technical, artistic, creative, administrative, interpersonal, being able to sell somebody on an idea or a product, and innovative, inventive. If you don't have a sense of where your skills lie at this point in time, or are just having a little bit of a hard time sort of assessing and identifying for yourself, there are lots of skills inventory worksheets. There are many, many free versions online. So I guarantee if you just Google that phrase, you're going to see plenty to look at. But one site that I would highly recommend is Career One Stop. So Career One Stop is a really, really comprehensive resource for career exploration. And they actually have a skills inventory assessment that I like. It's called the Career One Stop Skills Matcher. And so you're going to be able to kind of go through and answer a few questions, and they're going to be able to help kind of guide you into what they're, based on your self-report, of what skills are a match for you. But I would also think about taking this offline and thinking about asking people in your network, where do they think your skills lie? Are there any other skills that they think you need to work on? A lot of times this comes out in terms of performance evaluations at work. So even going back and sort of reflecting on those performance evaluations and seeing what has been listed, what people time and time again say as sort of your top skills and attributes. And making sure that you're connecting with sort of your PI, your boss, your colleagues, and asking them for their input. That's always a good way to kind of get an idea of an external perspective of how other people see you in terms of where your skills lie. The next part of the self-analysis is really focusing on your interests. And so interests are pretty self-explanatory, right? So this is what you like to do. And so these are not skills, although these interests can be learned. Just because you have a skill does not mean you have an interest in that area. And so jobs can often combine multiple interests. So thinking about my job in particular, my job is really well suited for me because I get to work with people and I get to work with ideas. And so those are some of my main interest areas. And interests don't always have to be equivalent to what you end up pursuing vocationally. And that's what hobbies are for. So it is important for you to sort of think about making that distinction in terms of just because you have an interest in playing the guitar, for example, doesn't mean that you're going to pursue that professionally and try to become a professional musician. But I do think that overall, in terms of identifying your interests, it's important to be introspective and to reflect on activities that you really enjoy doing. What do you love spending your time on, both at work or outside of work? And similarly to the skills matcher inventory that I recommended, there are lots and lots of interest assessments that you can take online that are going to also kind of be helpful. One sort of note and disclaimer about assessments in general is I think assessments can be a great place to start, especially if you feel a little bit lost and unsure about how to move forward. But remember that assessments don't know you better than you know yourself. So I do think that there is value in doing assessments, and that's why I'm recommending them as part of my presentation today. I think that sometimes just by going through and reflecting on questions that are being asked of you and thinking about what that answer is, and then seeing what comes up on paper or what comes up on the screen, and if you agree with it or if you don't agree with it, that's all good information, and that's all good intel for you to have in being able to then narrow down what your interests are. But don't take any of these assessments too literally. When we do formal assessments with trainees at the NIH, we often make sure that people are coming in and talking to us about the results, because I never want somebody to take an interest assessment and say, okay, this interest assessment told me that I should be blank, so I'm going to do this. And you might be laughing and saying, I would never do that, but there can be power in sort of seeing something on paper and feeling compelled to kind of move forward with it. So that's just my disclaimer before moving forward and talking about some of the assessments. Generally, though, interests tend to fall along this in terms of these different things. So interests often involve data. So as scientists, you probably have a strong interest area in data, things, ideas, and people. And this is sort of a nice world of work map that I found online. It kind of goes into nitty-gritty detail about people and data, working with data and things, and sort of how there can be overlap among these 4 different areas overall. There is a very popular interest assessment, and maybe some of you have already taken this interest assessment. It's often proctored in school guidance counselors' offices or career centers, but it refers to this RIASEC model. And this is based on a psychologist named John Holland, who believed that the world of work generally fell into these 6 different interest areas. And it's called the RIASEC model because it stands for realistic, investigative, artistic, social, enterprising, and conventional. And normally when people take the strong interest inventory, which is the formal title, but there are lots of different variations and versions online. One that I've listed here on this slide is the Holland Career Test, which you could go to and take a variation of it. But usually when people take this assessment, they get sort of a 3-letter theme code of their top highest interest areas. And generally we see realistic, people who score high in realistic, we really like to call them the doers. So these people like to work with things. A lot of times they like to work with their hands. So oftentimes when I have a scientist do the strong interest inventory, they score pretty high on R because a lot of bench work is working with your hands. Likewise, scientists often score really high in investigative. So these people are the thinkers. They like to analyze the data and the ideas. I don't see that many people at the NIH score really high in artistic, the creators, but every once in a while I'll see it come out as sort of an avocational interest. So this is self-expression, whether through art or music, whatever that might be. Social, helpers. So these are the people that like to help people. A lot of times individuals who end up going into clinical care score highly on social. Enterprising. So these are people who tend to do well in persuading. They like to build organizations, kind of, and build that collaboration. And then lastly, conventional. So this is often focused on sort of organization, whether that's organization of data or information systems overall. And this is just a really broad brush overview of these interest areas. But this is kind of a way for you to even think about what that might be for you and to kind of have an impression of which ones stand out to you first and foremost of areas that you think resonate most strongly for you. Some other assessments that you can find online. There's some really great ones at mynextmove.org. The link is there. And then I just want to spend a little bit of time thinking about or talking about ONET. So ONET is a really great resource. It's actually stands for the Occupational Network. And it's a website that is hosted by the Department of Labor. And they often coincide sort of with that RIASEC model. So you can go in and see the ONET interest profiler depending on what you get from your strong interest inventory or your RIASEC results in order to kind of see what that means for you. There's a lot of really great information on ONET. A lot of the data that they compile is, again, from the Department of Labor, often from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, where they're putting together information from the past year in terms of what fields are growing in value or growing just in size or decreasing. What are the basic qualifications that are needed in order to go into that field? So if you're somebody who really likes to kind of explore all of this data, this is going to be a really great resource for you to check out. So take a look at ONET and see sort of all of the different options that are available there in terms of evaluating your interests. Now, for those of you who are maybe even further along in your scientific career and you're really looking, you've done sort of the RIASEC model, maybe you've taken the strong interest inventory, you've looked at some of the resources on ONET, and you're feeling like they're not science specific. And that is one critique that I often hear about these assessments from NIH trainees that I work with, and it's completely accurate. The assessments that I have recommended up until this point are very basic, and it's going to, sometimes they're a little bit better suited for people who are just starting out in their career. Maybe you're in college and trying to decide what to major in, or maybe you're just a postback and you're just starting your training at the NIH. and trying to explore different options. But if you're much further in your career and you already have your PhD and you maybe even have one or two postdocs under your belt, and you know that you're going to be staying within science, it's just a matter of in what capacity, I would encourage you to also look at sort of the science specific career assessments. There are a few. One that I think is really nice is at biosciencecareers.org. And they have sort of used a variation of that RIASEC model, but just broken it down into different ways like practical, enterprising, creative, investigative, supportive, administrative. And that might be a nice initial sort of informal assessment to kind of give you some ideas and thoughts about how to move forward. Likewise, in terms of the science-specific interest options, I have them listed on the resource page within this PowerPoint presentation, but I'm going to touch on it now because I think it's a little bit related before we go into values, is an assessment. It's an informal assessment through Science Careers, and it's actually called My IDP. And as I noted before, My IDP stands for My Individual Development Plan. But again, it's an assessment that has been specifically designed for science postdocs. And so it asks you a lot of questions about your skills, your values, your interests, and then it generates 22 science-specific options, whether it's science policy, tech transfer, regulatory affairs, science policy, science writing. But I think that's often a nice starting point, especially for people who might be further along in their career. So people who are just finishing graduate school or are already in a postdoc. So I'm gonna give you the link to that on the resources page at the end of this presentation. Okay, so the last part of the self-assessment when you're thinking about self-analysis is your values. And I shouldn't be talking about this one last because I think that it's often the most ignored dimension of self-assessment. And this is one of the most kind of personal areas that you need to reflect on. And it tends to be subject to a variety of cultural, personal, and familial influences. And truthfully, a lot of times when I meet with people who are really, really unhappy in their job, it's not necessarily because they don't feel like the job is utilizing their skills or the job is completely outside of their interest area. It's usually because the job, for whatever reason, is not matching the values or needs that they have for their career and for their life. And so it is really important to think about and reflect on what your values are. So one way to think about values, career-specific values, they can often be sort of broken down into these different areas. So intrinsic values are often values that are sort of important to you personally and sort of your own fulfillment. So that often includes motivation, satisfaction. Intrinsic value would be somebody saying, I really enjoy working in a challenging work environment or a fast-paced work environment, or I really thrive in leadership roles. So those are some kind of ideas of values that are intrinsic. Extrinsic values would be sort of your physical environment, whether you say, I want to work in a hospital, or I want to work in a large research institution or a small research institution. Thinking about the pay, the benefits, titles, prestige, those are extrinsic values. And one kind of note about the extrinsic values is, and values overall, truthfully, really make this super personal to you. And these aren't necessarily things that you have to broadcast and share with everybody, but it is important for you to reflect on. So sometimes I'll meet with somebody and they will say sort of sheepishly, Amanda, it's really important for me. One of my main values is that I have a job that pays well, or it's really important for me to have the title of X, or to be in a leadership position. And, that's okay. Don't feel like anybody else is judging you based on what's important to you. But it's really just a matter of you thinking about what that value is for you. Lifestyle values, that often comes into sort of the intersection of work and life, and often work-life balance, and how your career might determine sort of where you live, whether it's a rural setting, an urban setting, and what that could be. So values overall are, really important to consider as you're making career decisions. Overall, I think that career values are one of those things that tend to change more and more over time. Uh, Usually, I feel like the interests that somebody comes and tells me about are pretty stable. I mean, it changes maybe here and there, but I think career values, that's been some of the most dramatic changes that I've seen in sort of the people that I've worked with for a long period of time. And I would say that usually these career values change, especially during major life events. So the big one tends to be when people become parents and feel like they need a job that offers a little bit more flexibility or is in a different setting that's going to be a little bit more conducive to that work-life balance. So just recognizing that even though you're thinking about what's going to be valuable and what's going to be important for you in terms of your work needs right now, that this can and probably will change over the course of your life and your career. So as I have noted for all of the other sections, there are also career values inventories that you can take online. So again, Career One Stop is a really great resource. I also found some other really good career values inventories through the state of Virginia. So that first link actually takes you there. And so this is going to, again, sort of ask you those questions about where you want to live, what kind of jobs appeal to you, those types of things, and thinking about your career values going forward. All of this can sort of also be accomplished by just being reflective and taking some time and space to sort of be introspective. So a homework assignment for you, if you will, a self-knowledge exercise. A lot of people that I work with really benefit from journaling. If you're not a journaler, it's okay. You don't have to do this, but just making sure that you're recognizing and tuning in to sort of the emotions and the feelings that are popping up when you're thinking about a future career path. Thinking about, does it sort of restrict you? Do you feel a little bit anxious when you're thinking about going into a certain field, or is there sort of a buzzing and an expansive energy and an excitement when you're thinking about it? Those can be some kind of just initial clues that your body is giving you about whether this is going to be an interest area that you should explore. So one thing that you could also do is write about your perfect day at school or work. You get to be the master of it. You decide the schedule, the classes, activities, clubs you're participating in. Be as detailed as possible when you're describing the day. And then write about a perfect day outside of school or work, and not one where you just sleep all day or watch TV or binge on Netflix, but where you're doing things that sort of you value and enjoy. And I really encourage you to sort of think about what that is, and sort of note those tasks and activities that you enjoy. Are there any commonalities between the two areas? Are there any tasks that time and time again you sort of get lost in this state of flow where you lose track of time, you're not aware of any sort of distractions? A lot of people that I work with, a lot of scientists say they get lost in flow when they're running experiments, or some people really like writing up results, or they get lost in the flow of writing. So think about what that is for you, and that's going to be good sort of self-knowledge to have going forward. There is a big consequence of skipping all of these steps and skipping this self-analysis and this introspection. And maybe some of you have heard about the 90,000 hours rule. And maybe some of you have guesses about what 90,000 hours means. But 90,000 hours is the average amount of time that a human spends at work. And this is often calculated over the span of your life and for just an average full-time position. And I would often argue that a lot of the scientists and clinicians that I work with at the NIH work way more than the average. And so this rule is even greater for them. But you spend a lot of time and a big chunk of your life at work and focusing on your career path. And so making sure that you're thinking about what's going to be kind of important for you and gaining from a career is a really important step to take first and foremost. And a lot of times you cannot gain this insight and this knowledge by asking others to decide for you. Sometimes people will ask me as a career counselor, what do you think I should do? Which path would you choose? And you know, that's not a great way to approach it. You really need to think about how you're going to approach this and what is going to be important for you. It's a very, very personal process. A lot of times you can't even get this information from reading a book, but you know, doing action steps and talking to people who are working in similar fields, and that's something I'm going to be touching on a little bit more later on too. So thinking about how you can move forward from step number one. So maybe you've done the self-analysis, you feel like you have a pretty clear idea of where your skills, values, and interests lie. The second step is research. So in research in terms of gaining option knowledge. So what are the career paths? What are the fields that are available to you? And that could be meaningful for you to pursue. So you need to often identify the skills, the hard skills, the soft skills, the certifications, the degrees that are necessary in order to be competitive for those roles. And you're finding that out often by a variety of different things. There's not one set task that you should do in order to get this. I wish there was, but there isn't. So thinking about some options in order to figure this out. Reading books, being curious, looking at blogs, websites. So a few that we would recommend would be Forbes, the Washingtonian, US News and Money Reports. Nature and science careers are really great websites. Our website as well, OITE, has a lot of different options, and I'm going to have a few key resources listed for you at the end of the presentation. I would also read job ads, even if you feel like you're really far away from the job search process, but looking at job descriptions and seeing sort of what those titles are, what the main qualifications are needed in order for that position, and aspirational LinkedIn profiles as well. That's all going to be good information for you to kind of have as a way of, oh, this person did this and then that, and then they did an internship here, and now they're the director of blah, blah, blah. So those are all things that sort of can be a passive way to compile information. And then moving into some more of the sort of action steps would be, you know, talking with mentors, colleagues, and friends, doing informational interviews. Informational interviews, for those of you who haven't done an informational interview, are really key in terms of your career exploration and your career development overall. They give you a lot of really great insider information about fields, about companies. If you're unsure about how to kind of start that process, you know, we have a link here. If you Google OITE informational interviews, this link will come up, but I've listed it here as well. And it kind of gives you an overview of how to start, how to ask for informational interviews, what kind of questions you could ask in informational interviews. I think this is probably one of the best things that you can do in order to gain this options knowledge, because a lot of times written articles and things become outdated very quickly, especially we're living in a world that seems to be changing by the day. So kind of having an idea of what the leads are in terms of market opportunities for different areas, you're only going to find that out from informational interviews. So I really encourage you to think about having that as sort of a step within your career development process. You can also, hopefully, when we're all able to go back into work, you can attend career workshops and symposiums and participate in internships and trainings, especially if you're a student. if you're a college student right now, if you're a high school student listening in, internships are one of those things that often you're only able to participate in when you have that student status. So really take advantage of being a student. It's a great way to try positions on, try companies out, and see what's the right fit for you. A lot of times people ask me, well, what can I do within STEM? And what are the career options that are available to me? And, obviously, first and foremost, thinking about kind of research and development, that's a main focus. Healthcare delivery management, obviously, those are sort of the two main areas that tend to stand out for people. But I've worked with lots of people. I've worked with probably hundreds of trainees at this point in my career. And I am constantly surprised at the variety of different positions and fields that they go into post-training. So a lot of times it can fall under sort of administration, education, policy, business, writing, law, patent law as a field that I've seen a lot of postdocs go into, and consulting. So those are just a few ideas to kind of think about, but obviously the list's very extensive. But when you're thinking about these career options, I really encourage you to consider that SVI match and how that is for you. So when you're looking at different career fields, recognize that there is a ton of variability within each field, and you're going to need to kind of assess that and sort of reflect on what's going to be the right fit for you. So as an example, I was working with a postdoc a few years ago who said she really wanted to go into science writing. And she was really focusing on all of her job search on science writing positions. And as we were kind of working together, it was clear that we needed to sort of delineate and clarify what type of science writing positions. So she was seeing a lot of technical writer positions posted, which is often you're kind of by yourself, hunkering down, writing very dry, dense language, right? Versus being in a maybe even in the same company, but in a communications director role, which would often entail lots of meetings, lots of forward external outreach, a lot of communicating, a lot of times to kind of large groups and external audiences. So same field, but very, very different positions. And so thinking about sort of what we had to have that discussion of which was going to be the better match for her, and really being able to kind of clarify which was going to be, again, the best match for her. And that's where it's important for you to have thought about sort of that SVI first and foremost, that you can quickly and clearly evaluate job ads when you read them or when you hear about different positions within informational interviews, and see if that's going to be the right fit for you. Okay, so we have about 10 minutes left, so I think we're going to have enough time to get through this all and then get to your questions. So step number 3 in part of the professional development planning is goal setting. And so after you've sort of done all of this internal research, external research, so after looking at where you are, where you're wanting to go, you're going into the goal setting. And so just a reminder that, people often like to ask about, oh, where do you see yourself in 5 to 10 years? Those are guesses. Nobody expects you to have sort of a very clearly delineated plan for yourself. So really focus on kind of a year at a time. And I think that's a good way to approach it. And when you're thinking about making your goals, really draft goals that are SMART. So SMART goals are specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and timely. And this is a reminder to kind of think about that. And that's probably something that you have heard before. But I think too often people set really either too lofty or ambiguous goals that are really hard to see if you've actually attained them. So the example that we have listed here is, I'm going to lobby for more locally grown food in the dining room. Okay, that's great, but how are you going to assess that? So a smarter goal would be to say, I'm going to collect 1,000 petition signatures from students. Excuse me, I'm going to meet with student administrators and leaders. I'm going to discuss vending possibilities all by the start of the new academic year. So this is more of a reminder to just clarify, and if needed, add more detail to the goals that you have for yourself. So overall, a few parting sort of reminders and tips, and then I'm going to see what questions you have. Remember that there are really no right or wrong answers to this process. It is a highly, highly subjective and highly personalized process. So it's really important for you to think about what's important for you. And you know, you're really the only person who has to be happy with this career. Sometimes I meet with trainees who come in and they'll say to me, oh my gosh, my mentor, my PI is going to be so disappointed that I don't want to do the academic job search. They're going to, you know, my grad school advisor is just going to cry at the idea of me not pursuing a career like he had. And so I really want you to remember that, like I said at the beginning of this presentation, a lot of the advice that you're going to hear about careers is often well intended, and but it's often also based on what that person did and what their path was like and what their life was like. And that doesn't mean that that's going to be the case for you. So just a reminder again to really make this about you and what's going to be important for you based on your skills, values, and interests. And a final reminder that there's not one career path, there's not one job that is going to give you absolutely everything that you want and need. So really pay attention to some of the most important ones. When you're thinking about your skills and interests, I think it's okay to sort of be broad. When you're thinking about your career values, sometimes I've seen people come in and give me a list of their top 20 work needs. And often they're like, I need a job that is really high paying and really flexible. And or, you know, with the whole list of lots of other career values that are maybe not realistic. And so really thinking about maybe what those top 3 career values are for you, what are the most important ones that you want to utilize within your career path, and use that as your guide, because there's not one career that's going to give you everything. And sometimes you're going to need to have some of these needs met through your avocational interests, your hobbies, and things outside of work overall. So a few more resources to plug, and then I'm going to check your questions out. We have a lot of OITE workshops. There's one on planning for career satisfaction and success. We have lots of videos on our YouTube channel. I actually think that eventually this workshop will probably be ported over to the YouTube channel. So check that out. It's growing by the day, given the fact that everything is virtual right now. So you're going to be able to see a lot of resources and a lot of really great content listed on that site. I've mentioned the Science Careers My IDP. This is the link on how you can find it. Again, it's an informal assessment that's geared for science postdocs and gives you a list of 22 different career options. And then reading our OITE career blog. So you might want to start following our career blog. We have weekly content posted that's new and relevant. And we also have an alumni spotlight section. So you can go through and see what NIHers have gone on to do to kind of give you some ideas of career paths to explore. And we have a lot of blog posts about career decision making as well. So even if you just type that in as sort of a keyword within the blog, you're going to see a few different resources listed. Okay, cool. So now, bear with me. I'm going to go through and see what questions came up for you all during the presentation. Okay. Okay, so a lot of questions about will the slides be made available to us? Yes, they will. So if you registered, you'll be able to click on the link and you'll still see the slides. So yes, all of this is going to be available to you after the fact. How critical are postdocs for getting into a competitive med school? Our med school advisors could probably better answer this question, but I think that varies depending on sort of the school that you're applying to and how competitive you feel you are as a candidate in terms of your GPA, your science GPA, your MCAT. Sometimes postbacks are a great opportunity to kind of help strengthen those skills and give you more time, especially to develop clinical hours. But it's depending. I've seen people successfully apply to medical school or grad school straight from undergrad, and then I've seen lots of people do postbacks as well. And one thing that I guess I would encourage you to think about is the resilience that I talked about within the presentation. That's really going to be important for you to foster throughout your career. I've worked with a lot of trainees who have applied to grad school or medical school 2 or 3 times before being successful. So don't let one sort of initial rejection deter you sort of in your career path overall. Okay, let's see, other questions. How do you balance an intense workload with your outside social life? Oh, that's a great question. I think that, you know, thinking about a lot of times it's about time management is so the most successful people who are able to kind of have a really good work-life balance and have that as a main career value really spend their time accordingly. And I've heard a lot of different tactics in terms of, you know, people who set timers, people who have certain days of the week that they do certain tasks, whether it's like writing or bench work or, you know, that they are really planning and prioritizing that free time overall. So I think that there are a lot of different tactics that you can use. All right, a lot of questions about the slides being available. So yes, they will still be available. Okay, are there any career questionnaires that are specific to a field of study? For example, I'm an undergraduate studying biomedical engineering. There are a lot of different directions I can take, but I'm struggling to decide which path is best for my interest. That's a really great question. And I don't know of any specific career interest inventories or career assessments that are just tailored for one field overall. I think probably the best way to kind of get that information would be through informational interviews. So, you know, maybe thinking about alums from your program, fellow biomedical engineers, or even just using LinkedIn as a tool to reach out to cold contacts. And I think a lot of times people are really great about answering questions as long as you're saying it's going to be only a short amount of their time that you're taking and you have just some questions about their career path. If you say, do you have 20 minutes to speak to me about what some of the career options might be? Most people are flattered and kind of willing to share and remember being in that position. So I think that's probably going to be the best way outside of sort of a formal online career assessment. Okay, after doing a self-assessment, what advice do you have for recent graduates for where they can find these positions that match their values, interests, and skills? So a lot of it is going to be on you in order to make that judgment. So I think you're going to need to have sort of the results of your self-assessment kind of in mind as you're job searching, and seeing how that matches with the job ad is going to be the first step. But really, I think a lot of this information, and I'm being truthful here, is gleaned from the interview and also from networking. I've seen a lot of job ads and people have sort of reported to me that they've applied for positions that seem like a really great fit on paper. And then when they went to the interview, they realized, oh, this is going to be like 80 plus hours a week. I don't think I'm up for this. So I think it's going to be one of those things that you're going to have to use a lot of the data that you're getting from a lot of different time points during your job search in order to see if that's going to be the good match. Okay, let's see. The career values that I have don't seem to completely match the job I want to pursue. Would you recommend following my interests or following my career values more? Oh, this is a great question. It's also a really hard question to answer. I think that things like this are often best sort of discussed with career advisors and mentors in order to kind of more fully see what that means for you. Hopefully, you're going to be able to find a position that is going to at least encompass some, and maybe hopefully the top 2 or 3. You know, I wouldn't want you to sacrifice doing a job that you're not interested in just because it's a good match for your values. Okay. As a master's student, I'm interested in pursuing a PhD, but I hear from a lot of folks that it's really difficult to continue a PhD for 4 to 5 years for STEM-related research. That makes me confused. How could I decide to pursue a PhD in that? Again, great question, and I think that the best way to kind of glean that is, again, through informational interviews. So this is why I really, really recommend informational interviews, because a question like this, you're not going to be able to easily answer by Googling it or reading online. And when you're thinking about doing informational interviews, really think about having, as a scientist, you're not going to have an N of one. So you should talk to at least a few, hopefully a dozen or more people who are in these career paths and are going to be able to kind of give you some of this insider information. I think that's really the way that you're then going to be able to sort of make an informed decision about yourself. All right, I know we're out of time, so let me just answer one more question, and then if I wasn't able to get to yours, I'll try to follow up with you personally. Let's see. Okay, as a chemistry major going into my junior year, how would you approach shifting focus to a different related area of study as I go through my career? So yeah, I think just in taking different classes, even thinking about different internship opportunities that you could participate in order to kind of diversify the skills that are listed on your resume. You're always wanting to think about how you're going to be marketed to external audiences. And that can often come through academic coursework. It doesn't necessarily just have to be paid positions. It could be volunteering in different community organizations or even student-run organizations. And so I think those are all really, really valid experiences in the eyes of search committees, job search, recruiters, all of the above. Okay, so I hope that this was helpful for you in thinking about the framework that you can use as you're career planning and making career decisions. Thank you so much for taking the time to join me today, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you all so much. Bye-bye.